He served his country with honor, carried scars most would never see, and returned home hoping for peace. For him, one truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was a living memory of loyalty, sacrifice, and survival. But what began as pride in his driveway would soon turn into a battlefield against the very neighbors who claimed to value community. Raymond Carter had spent 22 years in the military, most of them stationed overseas. His life had been defined by structure, order, and sacrifice. When he finally retired, he sought the quiet comfort of a suburban neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and the kind of silence that promised rest to a man who had given so much of himself to his country, to his neighbors. He appeared as a disciplined yet gentle figure, broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, always greeting others with a nod of respect. To himself, he was simply trying to rebuild a life outside the rigid discipline of the Navy. But among everything he owned, there was one possession that stood above all else: his truck. It wasn't flashy or new. The paint was faded in places. The rims carried the marks of long journeys, and the seats bore the wear of countless rides. But for Raymond, it was priceless. That truck had been with him since his second deployment. He had bought it after returning from a grueling mission, and it became more than transportation. It became a symbol of survival. The vehicle had carried him across bases, through long hauls back home, and had even served as a sleeping space when he couldn't face the four walls of military housing. Every dent had a story, every scratch a memory. To others, it was just an old pickup. To him, it was a reminder that he had made it back when so many didn't. Raymond treated the truck with care that bordered on reverence. Every Sunday morning, before church, he would wash it down carefully. He polished the chrome, checked the tires, and ran his hand along the hood with the same meticulousness he once applied to his service rifle. Neighbors saw him often, humming softly as he worked, sometimes pausing to wave at the kids riding their bikes nearby. No one could deny he loved that truck. The neighborhood itself seemed ideal. It was a planned community with identical street lamps and neatly trimmed hedges. Families grilled in their backyards on weekends. Kids played basketball on driveways, and retirees walked their dogs in the early mornings. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved to each other, even if they didn't know names. But beneath that picture-perfect exterior lurked a different power: the Homeowners Association, or HOA. The HOA prided itself on keeping everything uniform. They wanted houses painted only in pre-approved shades of beige, mailboxes that looked exactly alike, and cars that didn't distract from a neighborhood's charm. On the surface, their rules were about order. In practice, it often meant a few board members wielding their authority like a weapon, enforcing personal preferences under the guise of community standards. At first, Raymond didn't think much about it. He had lived under strict regulations his whole life: military dress codes, conduct codes, endless lists of rules. Following guidelines was second nature to him. He paid his dues on time, maintained his lawn, and kept his property in perfect condition. He believed, almost naively, that the HOA would appreciate someone like him. But what he didn't know was that his beloved truck had already drawn the wrong kind of attention. Parked neatly in his driveway, the truck stood out in a neighborhood filled with polished SUVs and modern sedans. It wasn't that his vehicle was messy or broken down. Raymond kept it spotless. It was simply different. And for people like the HOA president, different was unacceptable. Raymond's peace at home was genuine in those first few months. He woke early, ran a few miles like old habits demanded, and tended his garden with the same discipline he once applied to field operations. He often invited neighbors' kids to help him with yard work, teaching them small lessons about responsibility and pride in one's home. Parents liked him. Children admired him. To most, he was a quiet veteran who had earned respect without needing to say a word. On weekends, he drove his truck to the nearby lake, sometimes alone, sometimes with visiting family. His niece, a bubbly 10-year-old, loved sitting in the passenger seat, pretending she was on an adventure mission. Every moment in that truck stitched more memories into the life he was rebuilding. Yet while Raymond's heart tied him to his truck, the HOA president's eyes locked on it with disdain. The man was known for his stiff posture, iron shirts, and a permanent frown that seemed etched onto his face. He believed the neighborhood was his personal kingdom, and he enforced the rules with an iron grip. To him, Raymond's truck wasn't a sentimental treasure. It was an eyesore, a blemish on his carefully curated streets. But at this stage, Raymond didn't know the battle that was coming. He didn't know how much hostility a simple vehicle could attract. For now, he was just a man at peace, cherishing the first real taste of freedom after decades of service. Still, if you look closely, there were already cracks in the illusion of peace. Small things. The HOA president lingering a little too long as he walked past Raymond's driveway, the disapproving glances during board meetings, the whispered complaints of standards not being met. They were faint, almost invisible, but like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, they foreshadowed the war ahead. For Raymond, his truck was a memory of battles fought and victories earned. For the HOA president, it was a target. And when two men with such opposite perspectives collide, conflict is inevitable. Because in this neighborhood, the battlefield wasn't desert sands or foreign soil. It was a driveway, a truck, and the pride of a veteran who had no intention of backing down. The first letter arrived tucked neatly into Raymond's mailbox. At first glance, it looked official, stamped with the HOA logo and written in a stiff, formal tone. The letter politely reminded him of the neighborhood guidelines concerning vehicle appearances and parking. It claimed his truck was not in alignment with the standards of the community and suggested he park it somewhere less visible. Raymond read it twice, his brow furrowing slightly. He had gone through the HOA handbook carefully when he moved in, and nowhere did it say residents couldn't park their trucks in their own driveways. The rules mentioned things like broken-down vehicles, cars with expired tags, or oversized campers, but nothing applied to his truck. His was clean, up-to-date, and perfectly roadworthy. He set the letter aside with a calm sigh. Years in the Navy had taught him not to overreact. To him, this was probably a clerical mistake, an overzealous HOA member sending blanket notices without checking facts. He decided to ignore it, but the second letter came only a week later. This one was less polite. It cited multiple complaints from neighbors and accused his truck of being unsightly and disruptive to uniformity of the neighborhood. The language was sharper, bordering on threatening. If the matter wasn't addressed, further action would be taken. Raymond folded the paper carefully and placed it in a small drawer. He was no stranger to confrontation, but he did want to start trouble in a place he had chosen for peace. Still, a part of him knew this wasn't just about a truck. It was about someone looking for control. That suspicion was confirmed the day he met the HOA president face-to-face. It was a Tuesday evening, just as Raymond was returning from the grocery store. He had barely closed the truck's door when a tall, broad man in a pressed polo shirt and khaki pants approached with a clipboard in hand. His smile was thin, forced, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Carter, I presume?" the man asked, his tone polite but sharp. "Yes, sir," Raymond replied evenly, standing tall. The man extended a hand half-heartedly. "I'm Daniel Whitmore, HOA president. I wanted to discuss that vehicle of yours." He gestured toward the truck with a hint of disgust, as if pointing out a stain on an otherwise clean shirt. Raymond crossed his arms, his posture calm but firm. "My truck?" "Yes," Whitmore said, flipping through papers on his clipboard. "We've had several complaints. The community guidelines are very clear about maintaining a certain standard. Large, industrial-looking vehicles can affect property values and, frankly, disrupt the appearance we're striving for." Raymond studied him for a moment, noting the stiff posture, the arrogance in his tone. "With respect, sir, my truck is registered, clean, and well-maintained. There's nothing in the handbook against parking it here." Whitmore's smile tightened. "Handbooks don't cover everything, Mr. Carter. Sometimes discretion and interpretation are required. That's why the HOA board exists." Raymond didn't flinch. He had faced commanding officers, foreign negotiators, even hostile combatants. This man's thinly veiled condescension barely scratched the surface of intimidation. "I follow rules, Mr. Whitmore. I read the handbook before I moved here, and as far as I can see, I'm in compliance." For a brief second, Whitmore's mask slipped. Annoyance flickered in his eyes. But he quickly recovered, offering another strained smile. "Well, Perhaps you should reconsider. After all, harmony in the neighborhood benefits everyone. I'd hate for this to escalate. Raymond gave a curt nod, refusing to argue further. Have a good evening, Mr. Whitmore. As Whitmore walked away, Raymond could feel the man's eyes burning into his back. It was a look he knew well, the look of someone who wasn't used to being challenged. Over the next few weeks, the letters became more frequent. Each one carried harsher language, each one citing vague rules or community concerns. Whitmore began knocking on Raymond's door unannounced, sometimes pretending to be checking in, but always circling back to the truck. The neighbors noticed too. Some whispered about it at block parties. Others avoided eye contact when Raymond passed by. A few offered sympathetic smiles, but no one spoke up publicly. They knew how ruthless the HOA could be, and most preferred to stay out of crossfire. One evening, Raymond sat on his porch, sipping black coffee as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. He watched Whitmore stroll past with his clipboard again, pausing in front of the truck like a general inspecting enemy lines. Raymond set his cup down slowly, his jaw tightening. He had endured much in his life. Hardship, loss, injustice. But there was something particularly aggravating about this man's smug attempt to control him. The following week, the HOA summoned Raymond to a board meeting. He arrived on time, wearing a neatly pressed shirt and carrying a folder with all his truck's paperwork. Inside the meeting room, Whitmore sat at the head of the table, flanked by board members who nodded obediently at every word he spoke. Mr. Carter, Whitmore began, his voice dripping with false courtesy. We've discussed your situation extensively. Your vehicle remains a point of concern for the community. You've been given multiple notices, and yet the issue persists. Raymond opened his folder calmly, laying out his documents. With all due respect, my vehicle is fully registered, inspected, and compliant. There is nothing in your handbook that prohibits it. If you have specific complaints, I'd like them on record. The room shifted uncomfortably. Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he pressed on. Sometimes, Mr. Carter, it's not about what's written. It's about what's right for the community image. And frankly, your truck doesn't fit. Raymond's voice was steady, but his eyes hardened. I didn't risk my life for 20 years just to come home and be told my truck is unwelcome in my own driveway. The words landed like a strike. For a moment, the room fell silent, but Whitmore quickly leaned back, masking his irritation with a smug smile. We'll be sending a final notice. I suggest you take it seriously. Raymond left the meeting with his head high, but he knew now there was no misunderstanding. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about community. This was about one man's ego and his determination to break someone he thought would bend easily. As he walked back to his truck under the glow of the street lamps, Raymond ran his hand across the hood once more. He wasn't just protecting a vehicle. He was protecting the memories it carried, the pride it represented, and the freedom it symbolized. And if the HOA president thought he would roll over quietly, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The final notice never really felt final. It was only the beginning of a steady stream of harassment that dripped into Raymond's life like water torture. Every week brought a new envelope with the HOA logo, and each one carried a complaint stranger than the last. One letter accused him of oil stains on his driveway, even though Raymond checked daily and kept the pavement spotless. Another claimed his lawn wasn't trimmed to the exact length required, though he mowed it every Saturday with military precision. Yet another warned him about unauthorized outdoor equipment, pointing vaguely at the garden tools neatly arranged in his shed. Raymond began saving every notice in a growing folder. The stack grew thick within a month, each page evidence of a campaign that was less about community standards and more about personal vendetta. Neighbors noticed. They saw Whitmore pacing the street in the evenings, clipboard in hand, pausing longer than necessary outside Raymond's home. They whispered about the constant letters, about the board meetings filled with unnecessary drama. But when Raymond passed them on his morning runs or greeted them while washing his truck, their smiles were quick, nervous. They sympathized silently, but dared not speak against the HOA. One afternoon, Raymond overheard two neighbors talking near the mailbox. I heard they're after Carter again, one whispered. Yeah, Whitmore says the truck lowers property values. The other replied. Ridiculous. The man served this country. That truck's cleaner than my SUV. Keep it down. You don't want Whitmore hearing you. The voices lowered further until Raymond could hear no more. He closed his mailbox quietly, the folder of notices tucked under his arm. It stung, not the gossip itself, but the silence. He had fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. And yet here, in his own neighborhood, no one seemed willing to stand beside him. At the next HOA meeting, Whitmore escalated his campaign. He presented a slideshow of violations, pointing dramatically at photos of Raymond's truck parked in the driveway. "This is exactly the kind of disruption we cannot allow," Whitmore declared, his voice filled with manufactured concern. "We have standards for a reason. If we let one person slide, soon the whole neighborhood suffers." Raymond raised his hand calmly. "Mr. Whitmore, my vehicle is compliant in every legal way. There is no written rule against it. These so-called violations are fabricated." Whitmore's lips curled into a thin smile. "Rules evolve, Mr. Carter, and the community has spoken." But Raymond noticed how the other board members avoided his eyes. They weren't voting with conviction. They were nodding out of fear, unwilling to cross the president who held their dues, their permissions, and their reputations in his grip. The harassment soon spilled beyond letters. Raymond began receiving friendly visits from Whitmore at odd hours. Sometimes it was early in the morning, when the dew still clung to the grass. Sometimes it was late in the evening, long after dinner, when most neighbors were settling in for the night. Whitmore would knock, clipboard in hand, pretending it was routine. "I just wanted to remind you," he'd say, his tone dripping with authority, "that unresolved violations can lead to fines." Raymond's responses never wavered. Calm, collected, always with documents in hand. "You'll find I'm within my rights," he'd reply. But inside, a slow fire was building. He had fought wars overseas, faced enemies who wanted to break him, and endured hardships that tested every ounce of his discipline. Yet here, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a petty man with a clipboard was trying to strip him of dignity piece by piece. One Saturday morning, as Raymond was washing his truck, Whitmore strode by with exaggerated steps. He stopped on the sidewalk, arms folded, eyes locked on the vehicle. "You really don't care about your neighbors, do you, Carter?" he said loudly enough for nearby families to hear. "All we ask is cooperation, but you insist on being difficult." Raymond set down the sponge slowly. His voice was calm but firm. "With respect, sir, I've given more for this country than you can imagine. My truck is not hurting anyone." Whitmore smirked, glancing around at the onlookers. "Rules are rules. If you can't handle living in a community, maybe you chose the wrong place." The neighbors pretended to look busy, trimming hedges, sweeping porches, walking dogs. No one stepped in. Raymond simply nodded once, picked up the sponge, and continued washing his truck, refusing to give Whitmore the satisfaction of anger. But the silence of the neighborhood cut deeper than Whitmore's words. The following week, another letter came, this one marked with bold red letters, "Final warning before enforcement." It threatened fines, legal action, and possible towing of the truck. Raymond read it under the glow of his porch light, the words blurring slightly as his grip tightened. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a declaration of war. Still, he remained outwardly composed. Every morning, he ran his miles. Every Sunday, he washed the truck. Every evening, he sat on the porch with his coffee, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that was slowly turning hostile. But beneath the calm exterior, his resolve hardened. He had faced adversaries with far greater power and survived. He knew patience, strategy, and timing. Whitmore might have his board, his rules, and his clipboard, but Raymond had something stronger. Discipline forged in battle, and a will that no piece of paper could break. The storm was gathering, and Raymond could feel it. The next move wouldn't be a letter. It wouldn't be a knock on the door. It would be something bigger, something meant to break him completely. And when it came, he was ready. The red letter, "Final warning," had barely settled in Raymond's folder when the inevitable next step came. A certified envelope arrived at his door, requiring his signature. He opened it at the kitchen table, the paper crisp and heavy in his hands. This wasn't another vague notice or a politely veiled threat. It was an official declaration. Your vehicle has been deemed non-compliant with community standards. If corrective action is not taken within 14 days, the HOA reserves the right to authorize towing at the owner's expense. The words were underlined, bold, final. Raymond let out a slow breath, folding the paper neatly and set it aside with the others. But inside, a line had been crossed. He had been patient. He had reasoned. He had tried to play by the rules, even when the rules were twisted against him. But now they were threatening to strip away the one thing that symbolized everything he'd survived for. That truck wasn't just steel and rubber. It was freedom. It was memory. It was proof that he had endured wars and come home alive. And now some man with a clipboard thought he could take it away. 2 days later, the board summoned him to yet another meeting. This one wasn't like the others. The room was fuller. Neighbors in folding chairs, a few curious residents sitting along the back wall. The tension was thick, the air stifled with whispers and the shuffle of papers. At the head of the table sat Daniel Whitmore, HOA president, his expression smug with authority. To his right and left were board members, their faces stiff, some nervous. Raymond entered calmly, carrying his thick folder under his arm. His boots echoed against the tiled floor as he took his seat at the far end of the table. Whitmore wasted no time. He cleared his throat loudly and tapped the gavel against the wood. Let's call this meeting to order. Tonight, we will be addressing a matter that has dragged on far too long. His eyes narrowed toward Raymond. Mr. Carter's non-compliant vehicle. A murmur rippled through the room. Raymond placed his folder on the table, his voice steady. My vehicle is compliant. I have documentation for registration, inspection, and maintenance. Every accusation so far has been baseless. Whitmore smirked, ignoring him. He turned to the board. Ladies and gentlemen, this has gone on for months. We've been more than patient. Multiple notices, multiple warnings, and yet this. He gestured dramatically toward a projected photo of Raymond's truck. Still sits in plain view, undermining the image of our neighborhood. He let the words hang in the air before leaning forward. This is no longer up for debate. The board has decided. If Mr. Carter does not remove the truck within 14 days, we will have it towed. Gasps stirred from the back of the room. A few neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Raymond leaned forward, his voice firm but calm. You will not tow my truck. You have no grounds to do so. Whitmore's smile widened, the kind of smile meant provoke. We have every right. The community voted on this matter. Show me the vote, Raymond replied evenly. Whitmore's smirk faltered for just a second before he covered it with mock patience. Votes are confidential. What matters is the decision stands. Raymond's eyes hardened. He felt the weight of every battle, every injustice he had endured in his service. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he was resolute. You can fabricate rules. You can fabricate votes, but you will not fabricate authority over me. The room tensed. One of the board members, a woman with tired eyes, shifted uncomfortably. She avoided Raymond's gaze, but her silence spoke volumes. She knew what was happening wasn't right, but fear of Whitmore's grip kept her quiet. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his voice rising with false confidence. Then consider this your last warning, Mr. Carter. We will enforce the rules. If you refuse to comply, we will bring in the tow company, and your vehicle will be gone. It's that simple. Raymond sat back, his face unreadable. He knew better than to explode in a room full of people. Anger gave power to the enemy. Instead, he chose calm, his silence a greater weapon than words. When the meeting adjourned, neighbors whispered as Raymond walked out. Some offered sympathetic looks. Others avoided his eyes altogether. No one spoke in his defense. Outside, under the dim glow of the street lamps, Raymond stood beside his truck. His hand brushed the hood, the cool metal grounding him. He thought of nights sleeping in its cab, of long drives home from deployments, of the day he bought it with the first paycheck he didn't spend overseas. That truck was a part of his story, as much a part of him as the scars on his body. And now Whitmore wanted to erase it. Raymond knew then that this wasn't just about a vehicle. It was about respect. It was about dignity. It was about refusing to let a petty man strip away the freedom he had fought for. The clock had started ticking. 14 days. And Raymond Carter was not a man who backed down. The 14-day deadline passed faster than Raymond expected. Each day, he kept his routine, running in the mornings, tending to his lawn, washing his truck on Sundays. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside, every sunrise carried the weight of inevitability. He knew the HOA would act. He knew Whitmore wouldn't let this opportunity pass. It was a Thursday morning when the sound of heavy diesel engines cut to the quiet neighborhood. The low rumble echoed down the street, turning heads as curtains twitched and blinds lifted. A tow truck, bright yellow with black stripes, rolled slowly toward Raymond's driveway. Whitmore followed a few steps behind, his clipboard tucked proudly under his arm, his posture radiating triumph. He looked like a general leading a parade. Raymond was on his porch, sipping coffee from a steel mug. He set it down carefully on the railing as the truck pulled up, its brakes hissing. 2 workers stepped out, their faces blank with routine. They weren't here for politics. They were here for a job. "Mr. Carter?" one of them asked politely. Raymond stood, his expression calm. "That's me." "We've been authorized to remove the vehicle," the man said, gesturing toward the truck. "We don't want any trouble, sir. Just doing our work." Raymond nodded once, his eyes steady. "I understand." The workers hesitated, almost uncomfortable with his composure. They expected shouting, resistance, maybe even a confrontation. Instead, they found a man standing tall, his silence heavier than words. Whitmore stepped forward, voice loud enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. "This is what happens when rules are ignored. The board has spoken, and action must be taken. Order must be maintained." His words hung in the air like a victory speech. A few neighbors watched from porches, their expressions mixed, some sympathetic, others cautious, a few perhaps secretly satisfied that the HOA's power remained unchallenged. The workers began their task, hooking chains beneath the truck, tightening clamps around the wheels. The metal groaned as the vehicle was lifted, inch by inch, onto the flatbed. Raymond's eyes never left it. Every scrape of steel, every tightening bolt, was like a memory being torn away. He thought of his first drive in that truck, his niece laughing beside him. He thought of the nights parked near bases, staring at the stars when sleep wouldn't come. He thought of the times he sat behind its wheel, gripping it tightly after funerals of friends who hadn't made it home. The truck wasn't just a possession. It was a companion, a witness to his life. And now, piece by piece, it was being stolen from him under the guise of community standards. When the engine of the tow truck roared to life, Whitmore clapped his hands together, turning to the watching neighbors. "Let this be a lesson," he declared. "We live by rules or we live by chaos." Mr. Carter made his choice. Raymond remained silent, his face unreadable. His hands were steady at his sides, his shoulders squared. To the onlookers, he seemed indifferent, almost attached. But those who knew the discipline of soldiers would recognize it for what it was. Controlled fury, restrained behind a wall of iron will. The tow truck pulled away slowly, the veteran's beloved vehicle chained and lifted, rolling down the street like a trophy of conquest. Raymond watched it until it disappeared around the corner. Only then did he turn back to his porch, picking up his coffee mug once more. Whitmore smirked as he passed by, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Sometimes, Mr. Carter, compliance is the only option. Remember that." Raymond didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was more unnerving than any retort could have been. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers for days after. Some said the veteran had finally been broken. Others believed he was simply too proud to admit defeat. Children on bicycles slowed when passing his driveway, curious to see if he'd replace a truck. Adults shook their heads quietly, muttering about how unfortunate the situation was, but none daring to openly criticize the HOA. Whitmore strutted to the neighborhood with renewed arrogance, boasting about how the board had handled a troublemaker. He carried his clipboard like a badge of honor, pointing out minor details in other homes, emboldened by his latest victory. But behind Raymond's calm exterior, something else was forming. He wasn't broken. He wasn't defeated. He was calculating. That night, alone in his home, he opened a folder filled with months of notices. each one a symbol of harassment. He laid them out across the table, one by one, studying them like a strategist reviewing enemy movements. His eyes were steady, his mind sharp. He wasn't just angry, he was planning. He remembered every lesson the Navy had taught him. Patience, observation, strategy. You don't strike first. You wait for the right moment. You let the enemy grow overconfident, careless. Then, when they least expect it, you hit them where it hurts most. Whitmore believed he had won. The board believed the issue was resolved. The neighbors believed the veteran had finally given in. But Raymond knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The truck might have been taken, but the war had only just started.